Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Progress City Radio Hour here in the Town Hall. I am Jeff Crawford, and here with my brother Michael. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Very excited to be back speaking to very special guests, and especially this special guest.
That's right. Now, if you have been listening in order, you will know that we have been on a boat for a while. We had a fun time talking about our boats as a theme, and this man has some stories to tell, but we've already talked to him about some stuff, haven't we, Michael?
Yes, absolutely. And, I went back and listened to that previous episode, and at the end, we kept talking about how we hope to have him back on. And of course, we've wanted to have him back on ever since. And so we're really happy to welcome Bob Holland back.
Yes. And if you have not listened to part one of that episode, it is tangential to this, but you should. There's a lot of interesting anecdotes. Bob was really involved in a lot of the Disney development company stuff that I was so interested in, the hotel development at Walt Disney World, a bunch among many other projects through the years. But I was always interested about how that went. And then, of course, he would go on to help start the Disney Cruise Line.
Yes, absolutely. It really was quite a period, especially that time when we were growing up where they kicked off the DDC and started bringing in all these big name architects to work on hotels, and just expansion was everywhere. And we talked all about that in the previous episode, so you should go back and listen to that, as Jeff said. But yeah, and then he took to the sea and started talking about the Disney experience afloat.
That's right, cross the sea. Yeah, a lot of Michael Eisner era expansion here. These are all symptoms of the same ambition to grow the brand and what they did.
Absolutely. Everything you could see at the 25th anniversary preview center.
That's right.
Tribute.
That's why I bought the t-shirt.
Absolutely.
I was not going on the cruise. All right. Well, let's hear what he has to say. Without further ado, here is Bob Holland.
Now, the last episode of our show was about Disney boats. There are no bigger Disney boats than those of the Disney Cruise Line, but this is an area we've never really discussed before, so we brought in an expert, someone who was there on the ground in the early days. So we're really happy to welcome back Bob Holland to the show. Bob, it's great to talk to you again.
It's great to be here. Yes, I was on the ground building it. Hopefully I was on the water when we were sailing.
Yes. Yeah. Hopefully, keep, the blue part is where you're supposed to go with the boat. So just keep that in mind. Since you were on our show the last time, it's been a while. Time flies, but you've been busy. You've been giving talks. You gave some talks about the cruise line for its 25th anniversary last year. And last year you presented at Retro Magic, which was a lot of fun. How has all that been for you?
That's great. That's fine. It was a busy couple of weeks because Disney had invited me to go on their transatlantic from England to New York when they were bringing the Dream back over. And I had never been on the Dream. Well, I probably was on it to visit one time, but I never sailed on it. And I did 7 lectures in about 10 days. And then 2 days I was back home, and then I did the Retro Magic thing. So I guess if my voice held up for that, we'll do okay tonight. We'll see. I have some tea. So.
No, it was great. You got to meet your adoring public.
Yeah, it was really kind of a out of body experience because you had the luminaries of the Imagineering world like Tony Baxter and Tom Morris and those kinds of people, and I definitely don't travel in that same orbit. I know a couple of them sort of well, but I definitely, in terms of public profile, I'm not anywhere near that. So it was a bit of an out-of-body experience, particularly actually both of them were. On the cruise line we averaged 700 people per lecture, I think.
Holy cow.
Wow.
And after the first couple. I mean, people just stopped me on the ship all the time and said, "Are you Bob Holland?" Yeah, I can, and they started asking for, I didn't do any autographs on the ship, but lots and lots of selfies and things like that. And it was, pretty strange to be that recognized because I'm a pretty low profile kind of person. And the Retro Magic was the same kind of way. I mean, people were asking for autographs. They're like, well, wait a minute, Bob Gurr's here, and people that are a lot better known and more important than I, but it was fun. So it was a different kind of thing.
Yeah. Well,
you have some great Dick Nunes stories, so that's worth a few autographs.
Yeah. Well, I guess I can tell more of them now.
That's true. Yeah. The embargo is off. You can,
I guess,
let it fly.
I don't know. But anyway, Dick mellowed out in his retirement years, I hear.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, what's it been like thinking back on 25 years of the cruise line? I myself find it hard to believe it's been 25 years.
Yeah, well, it is actually a long time ago, and I guess I didn't really think much about it or maybe realize it until Disney started doing their publicity, and particularly with the cruise line and the 25th anniversary and whatever. And I thought, wow, yeah, it has been 25 years. And I've been doing some writing, which unfortunately will not be made public anytime soon. But we have an Imagineering kind of newsletter that's published fairly regularly. And the lady that runs it asked whether I'd be willing to write the history, particularly of the Magic. So Wing and I spent many, many hours on the phone, as well as with some of the other people who were the early Magic people, because I didn't start day one with the Magic. So there was a year or so of history that I sort of knew about, but I wasn't confident enough to be writing about.
I know someone who was working on a project with Wing, and from what I hear, Wing can call any time of day or night.
Yes, he can, and he rarely calls anymore after about 9 o'clock Eastern time. He lives on the West Coast most of the time, but that's pretty early for him because it used to be almost any hour. I mean, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and sometimes wasn't very awake. I mean, distinctly remember one time being in Paris and was working on the shopping center at Mont la Vallée there, and there was a developer involved, and the developer put me in this Fleabag hotel in Paris. And anyway, long story short, I took a mild sleeping pill because I wasn't sleeping very well, and I was out of it. And the phone rang in this pitch dark room that I had no idea where I was. And I finally stumbled around to pick up the phone. It was Wing. And I must have been totally incoherent because I told Wing, "I'm sorry, we'll have to continue this conversation tomorrow." Anyway, so yeah, there's lots of stuff. I mean,
when the call comes, you have to be ready. Exactly.
I mean, we could do 2 hours on Wing tonight, but we won't. But he was a very integral part of the Disney Magic and Wonder and several of the ships thereafter. So it's hard not to talk about Wing when we're talking about the Disney ships.
That's true. I know someone who did some small design things for one of the ships. I couldn't tell you which, and they said when they were presenting it that Wing was very, very involved in every little detail.
Oh yeah, I mean Wing, he never let up, and at times that could be very frustrating and a little draining on us. But it's what made a lot of our projects really great, and Disney, and made us better. Although sometimes carry us along kicking and screaming, I think. But yeah, I mean, he was one of those guys, along with Marty and John Hench and Wing. Was not with the company when Walt was alive. I think he joined in 72 or 1 or something like that. But he clearly worked with a lot of the first generation Disney people, and that definitely was in his blood and his expectation about what we were doing, whether it was a ship or a hotel or whatever.
So this is, as I said, the cruise line is an area I don't really know much about. How did you first become involved with the cruise line?
Well, it's kind of odd because I was not a cruising person. I mean, I had never been on a cruise ship until about 1981, I think. Some companies started doing cruises to nowhere, mainly gambling and party cruises out of Canaveral with really old, decrepit ships. And it was just, it was one day. You didn't even stay overnight. And so my wife and I, this is before kids, and we're not gamblers. We decided to go, and it was it was about a 12-hour experience. It was about 12 hours too long. And it was one of those kinds of things where, unless you're a gambler, I suppose for some people, the highlight was, women trying to stuff as many ping pong balls in their bikinis as they could. It was that kind of cruise. So it was pretty grim. And then in 1984, the Premier Cruise Lines showed up at Canaveral. I think they were part of the Dial Corporation or something, and they bought a bunch of old ships. And they started partnering with Eastern Airlines to market cruises out of Port Canaveral. And Disney decided, hey, it's pretty hard to turn up at least trying this. And so they became part of that partnership in 84, I think it was. And sometime shortly thereafter, my wife and I, so we had kids, so at least one kid. So it must have been in the mid 80s. We took a cruise on that. It was like a 3-day cruise. And again, old ships and, not very big ships and not great public areas. And that their Italian themed dinner night consisted of rolling down shades of badly painted Italian scenes over the portholes. And then they played, really bad Italian music on the PA system. And, the food wasn't great and the service wasn't great. And Disney had their characters on board. And it really, in spite of not being very great, it was enormously popular. And Disney offered 3 and 4 day stays at the hotel at Disney World in connection with the cruises. So we took one without the hotel package. And in addition to being not a great cruise experience, my son and I came down with the flu or the norovirus or something.
Oh.
And I can remember lying on a hammock under palm trees on their so-called private island that was not private. They shared with about 3 other cruise lines. But I can remember just being, horribly ill, as my son was. So my wife and I kind of, said, I'm not sure we ever want to do another cruise again. So that pretty much, I thought, was the end of it. When Disney, well, actually, there's another piece in there that I had nothing to do with. And are you familiar at all with the SS Disney concept?
Oh, I've heard of that. I don't know much about it though. Tell us about that.
Disney ended their relationship with Premier in 93. I mean, again, it was selling well. People liked it, although there were some complaints about the quality of the cruise, and it wasn't really Disney. So Disney decided to get out. And a guy by the name of Tom Elrod, who used to be like the corporate marketing guy, he goes back to the Walt days, I believe. And the story goes that he was sitting next to some admiral or retired admiral, I don't know, at some charity event, introduced each other. And the admiral said to Tom Elrod, he says, we got a bunch of aircraft carriers that we're going to mothball. Do you think Disney might have any interest? So Tom started talking to some of the Disney people, and the idea of doing a floating theme park came up. And so that was in kind of the 93, 94 period. Again, I had nothing to do. I actually was working for Walt Disney World at the time, but we heard these stories of the SS Disney. In fact, it was even in some of the internal publications, if I recall, at that time. And the idea was to put a theme park on an aircraft carrier, although ultimately they decided that wasn't going to work. So they started designing around a big oil tanker. And they thought that they could put 10,000 guests on board at any given time and, have all these shows and rides and put the big rides up on top of the deck and all that kind of stuff. And the ship would sail into a port anywhere in the world and would stay a few days or a few months, depending on the demand. And it would be a great thing. And it was actually after Eisner and Wells were on board, and they were pretty excited about the whole thing.
That is wild.
The problem, of course, it had never been done before, but the bigger problem was a big problem because neither an aircraft carrier nor a supertanker can dock at many ports in the world. So it just wasn't very practical. So they kind of canned that idea, and some of the finance people said, it'd probably be less risk to start our own cruise line. So that's when the discussion started, sometime probably in 94, early 95. And, a year or so later, I joined a development company, and I started about 95. I started hearing these, stories about a couple of people at development company who were working with Wing on this cruise ship idea. And I thought, that sounds pretty cool, actually, despite my previous bad experience on cruise ships. And I really kind of wanted to work on it, but I was in the midst of something else. I don't know, Mediterranean Hotel, something else that didn't go. I don't remember, but I was busy doing something else, and I wasn't involved, but I was starting to get very, very interested in it. And then finally, like a lot of my projects, I was in Orlando, but I was still working on some projects at Disneyland Paris. The addition to the Newport hotel is a small meeting room conference facility. And we had a meeting there one evening to show Michael Eisner the interior design work. And after the meeting was over, we're standing out in the parking lot deciding where we're going to go to dinner. And Wing approaches me and said, would you like to work on the cruise line? By that time, they were about a year into building in Venice. And I desperately wanted to come back to Europe and do projects there. And I said, well, sure. What do you want me to do? And so he told me was basically to be the number 2 Imagineering guy in the yard. And I basically said yes, and I stopped myself. I said, well, I better ask my wife first, because this was not an expat assignment. It supposedly was to be, like a lot of my assignments, 6 months, but it ended up being a year. So after some negotiation with my wife and Wing and a few other people, I said yes. And so I think that was May or something of 97, I think. And within a few weeks, I was flying over to Venice with the vice president of Imagineering, a guy by the name of Mike Reiniger, who since went on to do many other things, including the Bright Line between Miami and Orlando. And he's now doing the Bright Line between LA and Las Vegas.
Yeah.
And he also was in charge of the big Saudi project where they're building all these theme parks and stuff. But anyway, I had worked with Mike in Paris and a couple other places. And so Mike and I got on a plane. He had been there many times before. And we toured the thing. And on the way said, we think we're desperately behind schedule, but the Italian says everything is just fine. And so we met with the Italians with the Fincantieri. And, we toured around the ship and stuff. And Mike said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, Mike, how many ships have I built? 0, which was the number he had built too, actually, and was the case with almost all of us, with the exception of the cruise line people. The Disney cruise line people were obviously very experienced, but those of us on the Imagineering side were not. And I said, I really don't know anything about building ships, but yeah, I think we're desperately behind schedule. We were originally supposed to deliver they were supposed to deliver in, I think, November or early December of 97. And this was like May. And they really hadn't even started installing interiors yet. And I didn't know how long that would take because they were being prefabricated, but I knew it was going to be a while. And there were all sorts of technical issues and everything else. So long story short, I got drafted, like was many of the case for my projects. And essentially, I was to be the full-time lead Imagineer in the yard. I mean, Mike was there quite a bit, but he also had other projects. So I ended up heading up the Imagineering team there. And one thing that became very clear was we were very short-staffed. So a lot of my first 3 or 4 months was spent in identifying people to join our team. And it was quite an exciting experience. I had been to Italy before. I love Italy, but I was there without the family, and my kids were like in high school. So, like a lot of Disney projects, there were pluses and minuses. So that's how I got involved. I got drafted. I'm not sure you get drafted into the Navy, but I did.
You say they were short staffed. I mean, was it just kind of a global short staffing or something in particular?
Global. I mean, again, there was no problem on the DCL technical side. I mean, that was one of the things that was really interesting about the project was in most cases, when we built a hotel, let's say at Walt Disney World or even in Paris, the hotel operations group would be involved in the programming and they would, review the design work. But as far as actually building the hotel, about the only thing they did. I mean, obviously, they had lots of things to do to get ready to operate the hotel. So they're procuring staff and equipment and supplies. And it wasn't like they didn't have anything to do. But in terms of actually building the facility, their main role was primarily critics to look over our shoulder, saying, oh, that concrete doesn't look so good, or that roof looks like it's going to leak or whatever. And in some cases, it was almost a bit of an adversarial relationship. Cruise Sign was very, very different because, one, they had a lot of people in the shipyard. I mean, I'm guessing, I don't remember, again, 25 years ago, but I think they probably had 20 or 30 people working for them, ranging from the captain of the Tom Forberg, who was named the first captain of the Disney ships. And then there were a couple other captains that followed. And they were in the yard most of the time. And, all the chief engineers and on and on and on, they were there and they were the ones doing the technical inspection, the whole steel welding. And then we had an outside firm doing work too, but we really worked hand in hand with the DCL people, which was a very different experience and was a much closer relationship. So they had a bunch of people, and I don't think they were particularly short-staffed. But when I got there, we had 3 design managers and 1 entertainment, theatrical manager, and that was it. And their responsibility basically was to continue the review of the drawings that were being done for the Magic by Fincanteria's various subcontractors, to supervise the installation of the work from a quality control and Disney design intent, to interface with the shipyard and all the various designers. And then on top of that, the Wonder was scheduled to be about a year behind. And although a lot of the public spaces were very similar, some of the spaces, like some of the restaurants and others, changed radically. So we were involved in the design of those and reselection of fabric and furniture and everything else for the second ship. So they were buried, frankly. And, over the period of the next several months, we probably added, by the end of that year, we probably added 6 or 7 or 8 people. And then by the time we got into like March or so, it was, Fincantieri had already missed our delivery date, but it was clear they weren't going to deliver probably to summer of '98. Then we brought in a bunch of more technical WDI people, some of them coming in from the theme park side. So we went from a staff in the yard of, full-time people of 4 or 5 to probably 25 by the time it was done. And one of my roles was to, find a lot of those people, and particularly on the architectural interior design side was to lead that effort. And so it was quite exciting, and it has similarities to building a building, but it also has a whole lot of differences.
That's something I was just thinking to ask was what is the difference? I mean, in a lot of ways, I would figure there'd be similar things and a lot of differences between building a hotel and building a ship like this.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of a cross between building a hotel and a theme park. Now, in the ships of those days, we weren't doing rides. We were just doing small water slides. But, in terms of entertainment, systems and theaters and whatever, they were frankly probably more complex than the theme parks. The rest of it, though, I mean, in terms of design, at least on the surface that most people would look at, it wasn't all that different than a hotel. You know, you have a lot of cabins instead of rooms, and you have restaurants and what have you. I will say, though, when designing a hotel, I never worried about the center of gravity of the hotel.
Yeah.
Now, you might if you were doing 100-story building, a skyscraper. I think they do worry a bit about center of gravity for those things, for heavy wind loads and earthquakes and what have you. But you don't for any kind of normal building. And center of gravity is really a big deal because, you'd prefer to keep the ship upright if at all possible.
Yeah.
And so they constantly were calculating where the center of the gravity of the ship was. And interior design finishes, particularly heavy things like marble and granite and those kinds of things, you have to be very careful about where you put them. And in fact, generally, you can put as much as you want, let's say on the lobby level, which is usually about deck 4 or so, because that's either at the center of gravity or probably a little below the center of gravity. But you start putting really heavy things up on like the pool deck or whatever, there can be a real problem. So it was strange in change orders with the shipyard, which that was a whole other issue because they pretty much refused to negotiate them. But normally when you negotiate a change order with a building contractor, you're negotiating on extra cost, if there's any. They always say there's more cost than there really is, and you're negotiating on that. And whether extra time has to be added to the contract, which again, they always will say generally it does, but not always the case. So you have those in a ship as well. But then the other thing that was in the change order was the calculation of the center of gravity. And, the shipyard constantly kept that. And, they are always saying, no, you can't use full marble on the 12th deck. You have to, there's ways of doing it. You use just a thin skin of marble on like an aluminum honeycomb. And it looks like it's real marble, and you tap on it and it feels like real marble. But in fact, well, it is real marble on the surface, but it's very thin skin. So that was a big difference for sure. All buildings, when you design them, are a little bit of a Rubik's Cube or a three-dimensional puzzle that when you move one piece, it tends to move other things around. Mm-hmm. The difference with a ship, though, is pretty early on, you have a defined envelope that for center of gravity reasons and hydrodynamic reasons and aerodynamic reasons and ship law and all sorts of other things, you can't really mess with very much. So your changes became very complicated because if you change one thing, it tended to change virtually everything else that touched it. So that was different. The other big difference, which caused us a problem with trying to get the ship done, because it was supposed to be done in November of '97, if I remember exactly the date, and they didn't deliver until mid to late June of '98. Normally, if it were a building on Disney property, first of all, we could call in our own contractors if we have to. I mean, that was one of the reasons the Buena Vista Construction Company existed, was at least in the old days, there weren't a lot of these specialty contractors. And so Buena Vista came in to do rock work and those kinds of things, but it also gave you a labor pool that if the contractor wasn't getting done, you could bring in Buena Vista Construction or any other contractor to finish. Now, that caused all sorts of claims and potential legal issues, but you could do it. Mm-hmm. And also with a building, you pay as you go. So, pretty much when a contractor says, I've done this amount of work, and you agree that, yes, they've done that amount of work, you pay them typically all but 10% of the value of that work. So they're getting paid as they go. With ships, the owner, at least every one that I know of, is not, yes, there's probably a sizable down payment, but you don't pay as you go. So, ships today cost $1 billion a piece or something like that. And essentially the shipyard is financing the vast majority of that. And so the Disney doesn't own even what's finished, or whoever the cruise line owner is, they don't own what's finished. It is owned by the shipyard, and they aren't going to allow you to bring in your own contractors. It just isn't done, as far as I know. And so it's hard sometimes to have financial or manpower levelers to pull to get the work done. So that was another thing that was really different. And then, of course, in case of building the ships, working in another country, although that's not dissimilar from building Disneyland Paris or Hong Kong Disneyland or Shanghai or whatever. It just happened to be in Italy.
Right. Well, you talk about the schedule slipping, and I would think even with delivery being late in 1998, considering when things started, for a company that had never done this before, built a ship or had a cruise line or anything like that, it was a pretty ambitious timetable, wasn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the amount of time that was picked to build the ships, from the time the keel was laid to the time it was supposed to be delivered, and I don't remember exactly what it was in months, but there was a contract time. And from what I know, it was not incredibly short for a normal ship. The problem was it turned out to be a short period of time for a Disney ship because there were a number of factors, but entertainment was maybe the biggest. No ship at that time had Broadway quality theaters. None of the ships had the special effects and other things throughout the ship. I was told at one time that Fincantieri said that the Magic had 4 or 5 times the amount of cable tray than any other ship that they had ever built. And they were one of the biggest shipyards in the world for passenger ships. So that was an issue. The other issue is just Disney being Disney. I mean, we were demanding perfection. Our interior designs were typically more complex and more highly finished than other cruise ships, and we were extremely demanding. I would say that on the Fincantieri side, the problem was Fincantieri is one of the largest shipbuilders in the world. I think they have like 13 shipyards in Italy, and they're one of the premier shipyards in the world even today. And they were back then, although there were issues because of the schedule. And when Disney wanted these things, Fincantieri, the Maghera yard, which is the one that's just outside of Venice, had not built a cruise ship in many, many years. They had built tankers and all sorts of other kind of industrial ships. And so building the machinery and the steel work of a tanker or a cruise ship isn't that different. And they were very good at that. What they weren't good at was the highly complex, highly finished interior work that is demanded in any decent ship, and certainly highly demanded in a Disney ship. And most of the suppliers that, what they call outfitters, in that area, a lot of them just weren't around anymore. So there was a shortage of outfitters or outfitting subcontractors to do the work. So, and again, the people in that yard, I think, probably could do a great job in managing a cargo ship, but managing a highly complex passenger ship with entertainment systems and everything else, they were frankly out of their league, and they didn't know what they were doing. From that standpoint, I mean, technically they were very good, but their scheduling systems and techniques were not good. A lot of their installation was by whoever got their first installation, and the rest of the people had to work around it. Normally a lot of the equipment and stuff is put into the pieces of the hull in the shop, and then the whole thing is lifted into the dry dock. And Fincantieri did a lot less of that because they just they had to get the hull finished so that they could float the ship, so that they could get the ship out of the dry dock to another place so they could get the other next ship in. And so they had to make those moves before they should have, because they just didn't have the interior, even systems installed like it. They should have been prefabricated. So it was a mess from an organizational standpoint, but they denied it all along the way. They kept saying, "How many ships have you built, Disney?" Now, again, the president of Disney Cruise Line, Art Rodney, had been president of Crystal, I think, and another cruise line before, Princess maybe. Had been involved in building a lot of ships. All of the technical people, the people who were in charge of not just operating the ship, but the engineering of the ship, all had experience. And they were all saying pretty much the same thing we were saying, is Fincantieri is really behind. But some of them didn't realize, because they really had never been that involved in the interior installation before, and had never been involved in anything like a Disney ship. They really didn't know how far behind we were.
Yeah. Well, I'd wondered if there had been issues with the building in Italy, since they don't do that anymore. Do they build in Germany now? Is that?
No. Disney?
Yes.
Oh, well, yeah. The ship 3, 4, 5, I guess now 6 or 7. I'm losing track anymore. They're all being built by Meyer Werft in Germany. And I got to know all the shipyards. I didn't at the time. I was working on the Magic, but I worked on 3 different attempts to build the 3rd and 4th ship, which eventually became the Fantasy and the Dream. And I was very involved in the design of those ships and the negotiation of those ships. In those days, there were 4 yards. There was Fincantieri, of which they have 3 or 4 yards that can build cruise ships. And they still use the Megara yard, and hopefully it's better than it was before. You have a yard in France, Chantier de l'Antique, that has been owned by quite a few different people in the last 20 years, which is a little unfortunate, but they're still building big ships. And then in those days, there was a Massa yard in Finland, which again had gone through any number of owners, but they were a viable entity at the time. But they've since been bought by Meyer in Germany. So there's essentially 3 players now. The Japanese have built a few, but they're really not a big player in it. So the later ships were all being built, or have been built in Germany by Meyer. I negotiated with them along with the other yards. It's, again, not to make cultural oversimplifications, but the Germans are very organized and very, they do it a certain way, and you do it their way. And Disney had to learn to do it their way too, in many cases, where Fincantieri, in addition to just not having the expertise in that yard, frankly, they wanted to do a great job. They are artists, in their soul. There's artists even in people that build ships. And they were very proud about building the first Disney ships, and they wanted us to like them, and they wanted the public to like them. And frankly, probably one of their downsides was rarely ever saying no. They would grumble and grump, and we said at the end of the day, "Well, can you do it?" Okay, So, they rarely ever said no, and there's certainly cases where they probably should have. And for a long time, the chairman of Fincantieri at the time, he kept assuring the president of the Disney Cruise Line, "Don't worry, everything's fine. We're going to deliver on time." We kept saying we don't think so, but then again, how many ships had we built? I remember one moment, and I had only been on the project about 2 months, and the cruise line was holding a staff get together where all the senior management of DCL was going to a resort on Longboat Key in near Sarasota. And families were invited, so it was a little bit of a social time too, although there were separate, very serious meetings where the various divisions were updating the president of the cruise line and other people on where they were in terms of staffing and acquiring supplies and materials and all the things that you need to do to start a cruise line. Well, Mike and myself were invited to come and give a status update on where we were in the yard in terms of schedule. And Mike said to me as well, now is our time to tell them, because they haven't been listening, but tell all of them in one room, there is no prayer of making November. And so, what was an afternoon of drinking beer and playing games on the beach, there was a dinner that evening that was, staff only. And each group was making their presentation, and they came to us, and we said, there is no way in heck you're going to make November. And of course, the president said, well, how many ships have you built? Well, not many, but we did get some backup from some of the chief engineering people on the DCL side. And the president of the cruise line kept saying, but I have assurances from the chairman of Fincantieri they're going to deliver on time. And we said, well, that's nice. So anyway, long story short, Mike and myself and the president of DCL went to meet the chairman of Fincantieri a few weeks later at his suite at the Fontainebleau in Miami, where those people always hang out. And, we just, tried to present the facts. And and again, at his level, if he had been smart, he would have brought somebody that was at a lower level who could really argue the schedule or whatever, but he didn't. And he was not convincing. And so after that, even the cruise line, the senior management agreed that November was not feasible. So, and that was a real blow, because they already had crew lined up. I mean, they recruit crew worldwide, and they had a lot of the crew lined up and signed for contracts to come on board in late summer, so they'd be ready to, start training and all that kind of stuff. And marketing had already been in place and out there for, cruises. The idea was to do test cruises before and during the holidays, and then do the first revenue cruises primarily right after the holidays in beginning of '98. And they realized that wasn't feasible. And so Fincantieri really never gave up on their date until we passed it. And they said, okay, how about March? And we said, well, we don't believe March either. We are not going to, and this is a cruise line talking, we're not going to put in place the marketing and the sales and getting crew over here until we believe that you're going to deliver, which ultimately ended up being a June date. So that was a pretty horrible day at the beach, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I would imagine. So what was it like dealing with the cruise line side of things? Because as you said, Disney is famous for doing things their way. These shipyards and cruise lines do things their way. This was an entirely new line of business for Disney, for you guys, but I assume, as you say, they brought in veterans from this field.
Yeah, I mean, what happened was at the very beginning, and this is before I was really involved, but they brought in some veteran, not just Disney World, but people from Paris and stuff who had worked on the hotel side and the operations side. And then they started hiring people, executives from cruise lines. A lot of them, the technical people, came from Holland America. A lot of the operating people came from Crystal, which was at the time considered to be the very top of the cruise lines out there. And so, and then you had people like Wing and Joe Wood, who was our hotel programmer, and they all work together with consultants who do ships all the time, both technically and also, shall we say, architecturally laying them out and what have you. And it really was a joint effort. At some point in time, once it went to the yard, to be honest, a lot of the Disney World operational people didn't exactly drop out, but they took on secondary roles. And things like the hotel operations and certainly all the technical operations, all those kinds of things were run by people who had come from the industry. And they were great people to work with, and I don't want to say that Disney World hotel people aren't great people too, but again, I think there's just a different mindset when you know you're going to be in the middle of the ocean and you know that things could happen and you know you're responsible for the ship and the passengers and you've been doing this for 20 or 30 years of your life and it's just kind of a everybody's in it together and there was much less pointing of fingers, to be honest. I love working with a cruise line. I thought they were great, and as I mentioned, I did quite a bit of work. I started again probably in 2000 on the first attempt at building two more Disney ships. We had design, the owner's design, let's say, which is like a conceptual design, pretty well in the bag. We were negotiating with all four shipyards. The euro at that time was 85 cents to a dollar. It was the perfect time to buy, and then 9/11 happened and everything stopped.
Well, I'm curious. There was so much, revolutionary about the original rollout. I was working down there at the time at Disney World, so I remember all the publication about, designing something with bigger staterooms, had a really classic look. Obviously, you mentioned the entertainment. It was a very different product. Can you walk us a little bit through the design of those original two ships, the Magic and the Wonder?
By the time the ship project was approved, Michael Eisner was very involved. And in those days, he was highly involved in the design of everything. In the last 10 years of his career, he was not so much so. And I think in some cases that showed, to be honest. Yeah. But he still was in the phase that he wanted to see everything, coverlets and carpets and you name it. So he was highly involved in it. And one of the first big decisions was, what do these ships look like? And Michael was quite dissatisfied with what was out there. He felt that ships no longer looked like ships. In many cases, they looked like accountants had designed them. They had very short bow sections that you could shove as many cabins to the front as you could. And they had, in some cases, vertical, if not sloping the other direction, aft, so they could shove as many cabins as they could at the end of the ship. And a lot of the interior design looked like Vegas. And he was very, very critical about both that interior design direction and the design of the ship, and also understanding that design of the exterior, the hull, the shape, the colors, and whatever is really the brand for the cruise line. So we were establishing a whole new brand. So what ended up happening is Wing and a couple of the other design people, again, this was before I was involved, they toured not only the shipyards to learn about what was being built at that period of time, but they also toured the premier ship designers. And when I say ship designers, there's two types of ship designers out there. There are the naval architects who worry about things like hydrodynamics and the ship tipping over and all of the national and international regulations that govern the design, technical design of the ship. And then you have architects that are much more like interior designers than you might think as a standard architect. So but they understand all the code regulations of ships, and things like flame spread and smoke development is much more strict than in a building. And so they found the premier 3 or 4 ship designers from an architectural profile brand kind of standpoint at the time. And like Disney did a lot of things in those days, they did a competition. So there was a competition between what was called Uran and Storbrätten, which is in Oslo. They're called YSA today. They're still Disney's premier architect for most of the work. They're out of Oslo. Robert Tilburg, who came, they're a big firm that still exists out of Sweden. And then a guy by the name of Noel Eide, who was probably the most famous ship designer at the time, also out of Oslo. And so they decided to do a design competition, and not surprisingly, the attraction side of the Imagineers raised me, what about me over here? And so there was an agreement to also have Imagineering submit designs. So these are, these are pretty pictures. They're not, fully laid out engineered things at all. They're, it's a pretty picture of hopefully somewhat realistic in terms of shape, that what the ship could look like. And as you can imagine, they got 4 rather different solutions. And they presented to Michael Eisner, and he said, I don't like any of them. And, I wasn't there, Wing was there, but, he didn't slam anybody, but he just said, I don't, this is not what I'm looking for. And they kept saying, well, what is it you're looking for? And Michael, kept saying, well, you guys are the ship designers. I'm not, we're paying you to design it. Don't tell me. And so they kept pushing. And Michael eventually said, he said, a ship should look like a ship, something classic yet modern, make a modern classic, different from anything else that was being built today, which was in the, of course, the late, at that time of the mid 80s. And he said, I don't want Vegas. I don't want white floating shoeboxes or milk cartons. The ships were kind of all white at that time. He said, I want something classic, but modern. And so there was a second round of competition. Nolite, who, as I think I mentioned, was kind of the premier name in the competition at the time, he said, I'm done. I'm finished. You guys really don't know what you want. I told you before, I didn't really want to do this. I'm too busy. I don't like competing against my friends. So good luck. Do what you want to do. And so then there was a second round of competition that was going to be presented to Michael. And just before the presentation, Wing got a surprise package from Nolite. And when he opened it up, there was another ship design. And it was very much a classic but modern ship design. And Wing was just floored. And so he called Heidi up and he said, what's this? He said, it's wonderful. I thought you had quit. And Heidi said, well, yeah, I had. But I got thinking about it. And he said, yeah, so I decided to, have my guy sketch this up for you. And he said, I'm too busy. I can't be your architect. The best I can do is say, this design is yours. Good luck. So they, as Wing tells the story, they put the designs up in the room. However, they covered up Nolite's design with some brown paper. And so there was a Joran Storbrotten design, and a new Tilburg design, and a new Imagineering design, which was this hulking thing. It was called Fantasia, but I mean, it was really something. And the information that I've been able to find at that point in time, they went out and we believe hired a guy by the name of Sid Mead, who was not a ship designer, but he was an industrial and cinematic designer, and actually worked with Disney on the first Tron. And so they did this really hulking, sleek. I mean, it's pretty incredible design. I'm not sure it's very friendly. But anyway, Michael looked at the 3 designs, including that one, and he said, well, they're a lot better, but I don't think that's what I want. And so he said, he knew Wing by that time and how Wing worked, and he spied the brown paper on the wall, and he said, Wing, do you have something else? And Michael said, yeah, we got one more. So he pulls the brown paper down with a flourish. And there was the ID rendering, which in this story that I just wrote, I have it juxtaposed to the photo of the magic on the ocean, and it was 90% there. I mean, it was amazing. And Michael looked at it and he said, that's our ship. And so from that point on, because Heidi said he just didn't have the time to work as an architect, the design responsibility got transferred to Joran Storbrotten in Oslo, and they were competitors but kind of friends anyhow, and it worked out really well. So that was a real turning point and established the brand. And what's interesting, so you talk about these other ships. I have a diagram where it stacks the ships on top of each other. I actually found it online, so you may be able to. I'm not quite sure whose it is, but they stack the Disney Magic and Wonder at the bottom, which they're essentially the same ship. And gross tonnage about 84,000 gross tons, and about the same number of passengers, about 2,700 passengers. The Fantasy and Dream, which I worked on a lot, we took to 100 and, well, actually, I think when I worked on it, it was about 110 or 15,000 tons. They went to 130,000 tons. So they went from 84,000 to 130,000. And again, that's not the weight of the ship. It's actually a displacement of the water, but it's gives you a relative idea of the size of the ship. So, not quite doubled it, but significant. And one of the things that I was really involved in is how can we keep as much as possible, not just the colors, but the profiles, that it looks like the same brand. And then when they got to the Disney Wish, which is 144,000, it was even a bigger challenge how they could do that. I had nothing to do with the Wish, but I think overall they did a great job. Now, what will be interesting is this last ship, the one that they bought that was in progress that somebody else was building, is quite a bit bigger than the Wish. And, the rendering, I don't know if I've ever seen one rendering and it's the same colors and the same sort of thing, but the ship is definitely a hulking ship. So it will be interesting to see how well the brand is carried through.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't have those. It's a very romantic design, the prototypical DCL ship, a very golden age of travel.
Yeah,
design.
I mean the prototypes were built in the 30s. They were things like the Normandy and those kinds of fantastic ships that were generally Art Deco in their interiors, and that's was sort of the starting point of the ship. Now, again, there were things like some of the colors and the Magic and Wonder have a much more elongated yacht-like bow compared to the great ships of the 1930s, like the Queen Mary. The bow is almost vertical. So that there were changes, but certainly that was the starting point for the design, and we really believed that was going to. It was something Michael wanted to do. Was he wanted to celebrate the golden age of cruising, but bring it into a modern era with certainly a touch of Disney.
Well, it worked out great. Jeff kind of touched on this earlier, but I was thinking about the innovations these ships brought to the cruise experience. I mean, you yourself talking about your earlier cruise experiences. This was not an industry that I don't know. There were issues. It wasn't always a family thing. You talk about gambling on these ships and that sort of thing. And of course, Disney comes along. They're not going to have gambling on their ships. It's going to be a totally different thing. How were these innovative?
Okay. Well, they were, and they were innovative with not having gambling, but gambling was seriously considered for some time because
really?
Wow.
It was determined that what Disney wanted to do, and it's interesting. It's less apparent on the new ships of Disney, so they've gotten away from it. But to a large extent, the Magic and Wonder and pretty much the Dream and the Fantasy as well are laid out. So they're zones. They're sort of adult zones and children's zones and mixed zones, and that was done very intentionally. And having an adult zone that was, at least in the evenings for adults only, that was intentional. But once they established that idea, the guys and gals that were coming from the cruise industry said, well, that's where our casino goes, right?
Yeah.
And, ships make enormous revenue on casinos. And they basically argued a cruise line will not be viable without a casino. And I've actually seen preliminary layouts of the Magic and Wonder that had a small casino. And ultimately, it bubbled up to Michael, and Michael said no. He said, "We're not gonna do that." At that time, Disney was much more anti-gambling. They certainly maybe on a slippery slope now with ESPN and all sports betting and things. But at that time, there was a lot of pressure to bring gambling into Florida beyond the one or two places that Native Americans had. And the Disney policy was no, we just have to oppose it because otherwise, they consistently lobbied against more gambling in Florida, and at least in those years. And how can we do that if we're going to have gambling on our ship? So Michael just said no, and I think he was probably one of the lone people that he just said isn't going to happen. So that was a big change. So what are the other things? The fact that it's a ship that families can enjoy. And when I say families, I mean from young children all the way through their parents, through the grandparents. And the idea was to design a ship that the family could be together or could be apart as they wished. And they all could have a great time, and they all could come back together for dinner or whatever it is. And that was pretty revolutionary in the industry, because at the time, and of course the kids clubs. I mean, I toured recently the one on the Dream, and compared to what we did in Magic and Wonder, they're light years ahead. But what we did in Magic and Wonder was light years ahead of the industry, because children's areas on most ship at the time was a small room where they had some board games and a few other things like that, and a couple of counselors or whatever, and that was their children's programming. And Disney was going to do something that was much better than that. So everything on the ship was pretty much zoned with the idea of adults, children, and mixed together. Entertainment, doing a Broadway quality theater and with Broadway quality shows was something that was just beginning in the industry, and certainly Disney led in that. Having a cabin, the cabin's about 22% bigger than the average cabin at the time, and can pretty easily sleep 4 in most cases, and in some cases 5. Having the dual bathroom, the 2 compartments, so that that actually is an idea that came out of the Walt Disney World hotels that were being built at the time, to not have your vanity in with your toilet and your bathtub. And so the idea, even though they're quite small and not luxurious in size on the ship, but you could get your kids and through the bathroom maybe quicker in the mornings than you could otherwise. So there's just a lot of things like that I can remember travel agents coming on board in Italy before we sailed, and they just said, wow, nobody has ever done anything like this. And it's true. In most cases, no one had done, certainly at the scale, anything like what Disney had done. Now, a lot of cruise lines do it because it's a good idea. A lot of them are good ideas.
Yeah, it definitely seems like something that really changed the industry in a big way. And I had thrown this out to some of our listeners that we were going to be talking to you about the cruise line and about designing these things. And one of the things they commented about was how well laid out the ships are in a guest-friendly way to orient the guest to their environment. The ships are very friendly to first-time cruisers. And the sort of design hints that are built into the environment to orient you to where you are on the ship. How did that become a priority?
Well, I think there was a lot of Walt Disney World operational input at the time, because like I say, when they first put together the team that was going to start to design on these things, they had a lot of veteran people from Disney hotel side, resort side, theme park side, who were very knowledgeable of how to manage guests. I think another key player, in addition to Wing, was a guy by the name of Joe Wood, who in the development company, he was our hotel programming guru. He came from Marriott, and his job at Marriott was to program. And when I say program, it's like determine how much space is needed for all the various functions in a hotel. And he brought all that knowledge from Marriott, but he also was a very good functional designer, not necessarily a great aesthetic designer, but he knew how to lay out things, and he knew how hotels work. And in many ways, a cruise ship is the same way. So that group working together with also a group of outside cruise people who were responsible for operating these ships. They all bought into the philosophy, and I think, again, I had very little to do with the layout of the first two ships. Did a great job. We did know that when we went larger for the second, third, and fourth ship, there was going to be a long corridor to get to the back restaurant. On paper, I hated it. When I got on board the ship and had to walk that corridor many times, I hated it. But there are just some things that are very difficult to get around, particularly as ships get bigger. I have not been on board the Wish, so my thoughts are strictly what I have seen on videos and reviews and things like that. So I don't know whether they're fair or not. I have read and seen people comment that the Wish is not as user-friendly getting around. I don't know if that's true or not. I do know in the industry what has happened is that instead of having three groups of elevators, they're tending to have only two groups of elevators, even though the ships are much, much bigger. So maybe you have the same number of elevators, but they're only grouped in two places. And I think the reason that's happening is there is so much demand for space on these ships, whether it's water slides or, I don't know, miniature golf courses or rock wall climbing or, all the bizarre things that are going on really large ships, including Disney ships, but certainly all of them out there. Now, they're all competing with each other about what is the new attraction that you can. I mean, it's almost back to Disney doing the SS Disney which is a theme park. It's almost become that. And because there is so much competition for space for those things, and many of those things, by the way, are revenue generators. They're not free. Okay. So I think that it has become more difficult to lay out a guest-friendly ship because of the demands of space for other things that may generate revenue, or you just need to be competitive with your neighbors.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say earlier that, I mean, if Michael Eisner thought the ships looked like boxes back then, I mean, I had bad news for him about what the trends were going to be, because now, I mean, it's wild. They're just some real gigantic ships that are just like a skyscraper on its side, really.
Again, they're being designed by people that are solely financially and competitive, not competitive in my ship looks good, but competitive in I offer more things than my competitor offers. They don't care about what the ship looks like, or if they do care, they don't understand. And it's unfortunate, that there aren't a lot of ships out there anymore that look like ships. I mean, I think the Viking ships generally do. And even people like Holland America and Cunard, who traditionally had built ships that were sort of in the golden era, now are building such big ships and are pushing the cabins all the way forward and all the way back. And, things like the profile of the ship don't matter anymore. And it's because of the pressure to stuff as much as you can inside. And those cruise lines don't have a Michael Eisner and a Wing Chow who said, no, we're not going to do it that way. Because there was a lot of internal pressure to add more cabins and to make the ship less looking like, what we believe the ship should look like. And they had all the numbers to prove it. But, Michael was the kind of, and it wasn't just with the cruise line, but he was the kind of CEO who would say, no, we're not going to do it that way.
So you've got this, you had these first two ships on the water. It was, as I recall, very successful from the start. And you go to work on this next wave of ships. So what are the lessons learned from the first two ships that you took when you set about designing the next wave? aside from more cabins, obviously being one.
Yeah, I mean, the Magic and Wonder were big successes almost immediately. The Magic had some, growing pains and teething issues. I wouldn't say the first month or two was as good as they would have liked it to have been. But you have all new staff on an all new ship, and the ship was delivered late, and there are just a lot of issues. But I think they pretty quickly turned it around, and whatever negative publicity they might have gotten in the first month or two was quickly over. On the third and fourth ship, there wasn't a lot that we were going to change other than bigger. We were going to try to keep the profile and the brand. We're going to add cabins. Yes, the kids clubs became bigger and more technically, kind of up to date. But I don't remember. There were a lot of technical issues. The cruise line was not particularly happy with the Magic and Wonder the way Fincantieri built them. Not that they were bad ships. I mean, they've been sailing for 25 years with the same company, and that's almost unheard of. Mm-hmm. So not to say they were bad ships, but they were difficult to maintain and operate because, again, the building philosophy of Fincantieri and their subcontractors was the space between a deck and the ceiling below is extremely limited as it is in walls. And so when somebody comes in there and says, well, I'm here first, I'm just going to put my duct or conduit wherever I want to put it, and everybody else is going to have to stuff in their work, is not a very good way to build. It's one of the things that led to the delay. And it's one of the things that has caused a lot of maintenance challenges for the cruise line. I mean, not at all say it's unsafe or anything like that. It isn't, but it's just they've had to put a lot more hours into it. And they, frankly, in dry docks and things, they've had to do a lot of retrofitting of things to make them a bit more maintenance friendly. So there were a lot of issues related to technical issues. It's one of the reasons I was not involved in the final bidding I had left to be a university professor, and I just did a little consulting after I left, but I was not involved in the negotiations. But, I can tell you from the people that I knew at the cruise line, they really didn't want to go back to Fincantieri. It just was a pretty horrible experience in terms of, imagine having ships that are 6 months late and a lot of the kind of the operational issues they had. Fincantieri bid, they were a player, but there was a strong preference not to go back to Fincantieri. And I don't know what the spread of pricing was like, but I do know that Meyer was the place where they really wanted to go, at least technically, because they felt they would get a better ship. And I think that's generally true. I do think after I toured the Meyer ships that they were building for other companies, and I felt that it was going to be difficult to get the same level of finishing and artisanship in a Meyer ship than it was in a Fincantieri ship. And a lot of it's kind of a cultural thing. Not to say that Germans build crude things, but they're much stronger at sort of technical, rigid kind of systems to build things, and where the Italians are much more artisans and much more go with the flow, and which is one of the reasons they deliver ships late sometimes. So they went with Meyer, and I will say that when I was on the Dream, which is substantially design standpoints very similar to the Magic and Wonder. It's Art Deco for the most part in the public areas. The cabins are very similar. The theater and stuff is just a lot bigger. But I just thought that the craftsmanship was a little heavy-handed, and I was afraid that was going to happen. Now, of the passengers who sail on it, what percentage notices the difference between the two? I don't know. Probably the architects, but beyond that, maybe no one.
Well, as part of this cruise line deal, we've talked about the ships, but there's also Castaway Cay, which Disney winds up obtaining an island.
Right.
What is involved with buying an island?
Well, again, I had little to nothing to do with it. I just heard the stories.
Yeah.
It was not easy, as was, Disney now has a second island.
Right.
That wasn't easy either. I mean, I can remember sometime in my last year of being at Disney, flying down to the Bahamas with one of our lawyers and a couple of other our design people and looking at some island, some uninhabited island somewhere in the Bahamas, and discussing whether it was going to be feasible or not, and then what it was going to take to actually buy the island or get rights to the island. It's not easy. I think particularly now for the second one, they saw Disney coming, so it probably got a lot more expensive. But there's a lot of environmental concerns. There's and again, I don't know whether they bought them outright or whether they have a 50-year lease, or I really don't know what they have, but it wasn't easy. Just acquiring the rights. The island, Castaway Cay at least, was essentially a drug runner island for many years. There was a landing strip on it, and it was believed that it was used by people kind of hauling drugs around the Bahamas and stuff.
Wow.
And there wasn't much on the island beyond the landing strip and a few dilapidated buildings. So it was kind of a blank canvas. The big issue, and again, big decision, and this is one of the things that set Disney apart, is at the time, every so-called private island, the ship had to anchor or use their geo systems to hover in one place, and they would have to bring everybody in on tender boats. Mm-hmm. And that takes a long time. I mean, particularly as ships got bigger, you're talking, 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 people or more that you got to move off the ship onto the island. Even in the days of doing the Magic and Wonder, when you had 3,000 people or something like that, it just takes so long, and it's enormous effort. And if you have less than good seas, it can be very rough or maybe not even possible. So Disney's decision to put their own dock in there was a big decision and really set Disney apart. Now, I believe there's a few others that have that today, but it involved investing a lot of money in the island. They had to cut kind of a channel in there to get the island or get the ships in there. Build the dock facility, which is nothing particularly spectacular. But they have crew housing. I want to talk about crew. I'm talking about the island crew. They have crew housing on board there that, I don't know what the numbers are anymore, but 20 people or so can stay on the island overnight. They have desalination plant to make water. They have sewage plant to take care of sewage. They also have the ability to hook up to the Magic. The Magic can actually pump fresh water and also fuel into the island. They later, after the island got hit by a couple of hurricanes, they ended up building bunkers on the island that, obviously the first choice is to get people off. But if they ever had a situation where they couldn't get everybody off, they, had a safe place. So, and then you have all the sort of the architectural and theming and, shark nets to keep sharks out of the area where people are swimming and
Oof. Yeah.
On and on and on. And Castaway Cay was certainly unlike anything else. A lot of the islands at the time were shared, so that 2 or 3 cruise lines kind of shared the same island, and one cruise line took one corner, another cruise line took another corner, and they had the tender in, so it was a big difference. The terminal, I don't know if it was the first branded terminal ever, probably not, but it certainly was one of the first. Most terminals that you see at Canaveral or Miami or wherever it may be, are terminals that are used by any number of cruise lines. So the port actually wants them to have as generic as possible. and then you just put up a couple of banners or something like that. And clearly Disney has that situation when they sail around the world, like when we got on at Southampton. That was just a generic terminal that Disney had some banners, but they wanted their home terminal to be Disney. So they hired a Miami architectural firm and worked with the people in by that time they were Imagineers, because it got absorbed into Imagineering. But, to build this beautiful terminal. But it's not unique today. I mean, Virgin Voyages, who I did a little bit of work for after I left Disney, the CEO of it is Tom McAlpin, who was, when we did the Magic of Wonder, he was the VP of Finance. He came from one of the big cruise lines, and then was president of DCL for a while. But he went to Virgin, and they built their own, branded terminal in Miami. So again, probably Disney was a trendsetter.
Probably so. And that is a beautiful terminal. Well, you mentioned, these executives, so many prominent executives have filtered up through the cruise line. And one thing that caught my eye, I was just doing a little bit of background reading. Matt Ouimet was president of the cruise line and started in 1999.
Yeah, he and I'm not quite sure I remember the Art Rodney was the first, and he he came in primarily because of his extensive experience working with high-end cruise lines, or leading high-end cruise lines, in particular Crystal, which was probably considered to be one of the very best at the time. But Art was, more of a operational guy that, frankly, probably represented the cruise industry way of thinking, which we needed, but was not necessarily a Disney guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the arrangements were with Art, and I didn't know Art extremely well, but he always seemed to be not like the perfect fit. And I'm not sure that he intended on staying very long once they got the two ships up and running. And so they brought in Matt, who is one of my favorite people, to be honest. I mean, if you want to read some great stuff, find him on LinkedIn, and I call him the Oracle of upstate New York. Every 2 or 3 days, he will write a expose about managing theme parks, hotels, guest experiences, not just at Disney, but also at Cedar Point or wherever he was. And they're unbelievable. And all sorts of people are tagging on about discussions with him. I mean, he really, so anyway, if you tag into his LinkedIn thing, and it's pretty phenomenal. But Matt, I knew Matt from Disney Development Company, because he actually came into Disney as the CFO of Disney Development Company. And he stayed for, I don't know, a year or so. And it was clear that he was an extraordinary talent. And Walt Disney World snapped him up. I think maybe it's when Judson Green was there. Judson at one time had been the CFO of Disney World, and when they became the president or whatever, I think that may have been when he grabbed Matt and brought him over. But Matt did eventually find his way to the cruise line, I think immediately succeeding Art Rodney. And Art wasn't a bad guy, but Art was kind of a little bit of a stuffy guy, and used to dealing with the investors and those kinds of things. He was not kind of a rah-rah Disney guy, and Matt was. And I think people loved him. And I know we were all disappointed when he got to be president of Disneyland. And as I think I mentioned, I actually met him briefly the other night. I had not seen him in years. And, he's just like, he's fantastic. He couldn't have been a better person. And Carl Holtz was also excellent, who I think came in after we met. And so they and then Carl went to be president of Disneyland Paris, and then came back to a president's position at Walt Disney World. And yeah, I mean, they've had some great people.
Well, we've talked about a lot. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that we've left out? Is there anything anything important we missed?
Well, I think that there's a different approach today to the Disney ships, and again, I don't want this to come off as being critical. It's just different. It sort of reflects where the company is today. When we did the Magic and Wonder, and I think to a large extent the Fantasy and the Dream followed, and that may also be because Wing was very involved in those two ships as well. The philosophy of designing the ships, other than being ships and following the great cruise line traditions of the 30s, was that they were going to be different than the theme park. And that's the way Michael thought about the resort hotels too. We didn't necessarily in a resort hotel have to tell the story of Disney intellectual property. We could create a new storyline, and as long as it was interesting and well executed, and had some sort of Disney overlay or attachment to it, which was usually in artwork and characters and things like that. Michael really looked at it as kind of a respite from the craziness and intensity of the theme parks. Mm-hmm. And so when we started the ships, that's the same philosophy that we took, was the overlying design piece was going to be the great ships of the golden era of cruising, which meant a lot of Art Deco, because that was what a lot of those ships were. And we were going to have artists do things that were fun, but not necessarily all Disney stuff. And it was a different era. Today, as you'll see in the resorts and also in the theme park, it's about finding where do you put Disney IP, and you can make the argument that the parks and to some extent the resorts, much less so the resorts, have had Disney IP in them forever. Mary Poppins and Winnie the Pooh, which wasn't created by Disney, but they bought it, and so there's been a lot of that forever. But they were also doing things like Pirates of the Caribbean and other kinds of things that was, if not original storytelling, at least was telling a story in a different way.
Sure.
Now it's about utilizing the IP that Disney spent billions of dollars on as much as you can, and whether it fits in the space or not is not so much of an importance anymore. I think Michael Eisner would have a real problem with that approach, but the current management doesn't. And the ships are viewed as, yes, the container that they're in is still the brand of the Disney Cruise Line that we created 25 years ago. It's still primarily a sort of a modern approach to the classic cruise lines. That's the container. But what's inside is something that's very different. And it's about telling the stories of this, various IP, from Star Wars to, superheroes to princesses to whatever it is, throughout the ship. And it's almost like there are a series of unrelated and disconnected scenes. And that's what they want to do. And I don't know, the current audience today may love that. And they may say, oh my gosh, the Disney Magic and Wonder are so stuffy, and it's like my grandfather's ship. And, these new ships are so much more fun and so much cooler. And it's like living Disney Plus, TV channel, which is exactly what they're trying to do. I don't know how the surveys look. I'm not even sure if they're taking surveys that would attempt to compare them, but that's where they're at. So, traditionalists like myself, I like to think that I was kind of part of the second or third generation post-Walt. They're now probably at the fifth or sixth or seventh generation post-Walt. They don't see it the same way. the Marty Sklar's are gone, the Wings are gone, the John Henches are gone, the Tony Baxters are gone. I don't necessarily mean they're gone dead, but they just don't have much say in the company anymore. And it's a different approach. So, that's what I would say about the Wish. I haven't been on board it. To be honest, I have a desire to see it for sure. Whether I want to spend 2 weeks on it crossing the Atlantic, I'm not sure. I guess if they invite me and give me a free cruise, I'll say, sure, no problem.
Yeah, you can't say no to that.
And I do sometimes wonder whether they will ever invite me again to speak. I mean, from what I heard from the entertainment staff, apparently I got rave reviews, and it was highly unusual to get. I mean, they moved me from the Buena Vista Theater, which, I don't know, seats 350 or something like that. They moved me to the 1,400 seat Walt Disney Theater.
Holy smokes.
We had standing room only in the Buena Vista Theater. And once we moved to the big theater, we were getting 700, 800, 900 people, which I don't know. They may have just been nice to me. They said was unprecedented. But in my presentations, I also, without bashing the company, I tended to express my opinion. And if people asked me a question, I would try to be, not out of line, but again, express my opinion. And I'm sure my presentations didn't sound like something that were written by the Disney PR group, because I've given those presentations before, and trust me, they were a lot different. So I don't know whether they were fighting me again. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I crossed the line somewhere.
I doubt it. I hope they do. I certainly, having seen you speak to the people at Retro Magic, certainly people seem to really enjoy your stories, as do we.
I think the audience enjoyed. I don't know whether
I know what you're saying. Yes.
I think that the entertainment staff was thrilled because, particularly when you're doing a transatlantic crossing, you can only do so many, bourbon tastings and things like that in the morning. And I think I proved to be a relatively popular alternative program to paying $45 and getting drunk before lunchtime. But I've heard. I would expect that my presentations were videotaped. I would expect that somebody may have said to people in management, "Hey, you ought to listen to some of what Bob said." And they may be saying he is never coming back again, but we'll see. We'll see.
We'll see what happens. You're always welcome here.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Always. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us again. I've really been looking forward to having you come back, and this has been a whole lot of fun. So thanks for taking the time.
No problem. We can always talk about muck more or something.
The people love the muck.
The tales of the muck, yeah.
Tales of the muck, absolutely.
Apparently so. It wasn't so much fun living it, but I guess it's all right to retell.
Yeah, it's one of those things it's always funny much after the fact. A couple of decades on, it's a lot more fun to talk about.
And this is true. And I have so many. I have very vivid dreams, and I have so many dreams about building Disney projects or making presentations to Wing or Michael Eisner or whatever. And it's kind of scary, actually, but it was a big part of my life. It was a very exciting part of my life. I like to think that I made some contributions to some pretty great projects. So and what I'm really proud of the fact, and the whole team, that we produced 2 ships that are still out there 25 years later. And again, that's almost unheard of for a first line cruise line to be running a ship 25 years later. They're usually sold off to some second or third tier cruise line.
Well, and people love these ships. There is a whole ecosystem of Disney Cruise Line people who love these ships. So that has to be rewarding, that it's become like a real lifestyle for some people.
No, it is. I mean, I had not sailed on a Disney ship. I did. It was sort of another one of my swan songs. I had told my management 6 months before I left that I was going to be leaving in early 2006. And the cruise line was nice enough to invite myself and my family on, I think it was the Christmas cruise, 1 week cruise to the Caribbean, which I spoke at a couple of times. But that's the last time I sailed with Disney Cruise Line until this past summer when I sailed across the Atlantic with the Dream. So it was nice returning. It was nice to see that at least those two ships are very much in the tradition of the Magic and Wonder. It was wonderful to see that guests were having a great time on it, and it was really wonderful and a little bit, like I said, an out-of-body experience, having so many people come up to me and treat me like a celebrity, because one, I was an Imagineer, and two, I had something to do with the Magic and Wonder. So it's pretty special.
Well, thanks, Bob. This has been absolutely wonderful, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anytime we think of another topic. All right. See you.
All right. Have a good night.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. So that wraps up part 2 of our interview with Bob Holland. Jeff, I always love talking to Bob.
Bob is a great friend of the show. He is a great follow on Twitter. He has a lot of great insight. He has such a good knack of putting things into the abstract or the way overhead view, and I think this is no exception. I mean, the reasons why the cruise line was different than the others at the time, why it needed to be there, all of it's really interesting stuff. And yeah, all this life in a shipyard, interesting to think about.
You might say, in the words of the Carousel of Progress, he sure gets to the core of the apple.
He does.
He does. Yes, it is funny to think about Disney getting into a line of business where they had no experience whatsoever, really, and having to learn the ropes and bring in people who knew what they were doing. And it's a lot like when Walt Disney World started. They brought in all these people from Marriott and other companies.
I was going to say that
to help run the Contemporary and the Polynesian, because they didn't know how to run a hotel.
Yeah, and they had the Hilton South that they just ran and kind of used as a test place.
Right.
Yeah, it is a lot like that, and a very similar expansion, and has been a very successful one for them. It's this. What I didn't say in the intro is that this is bumping up against our kind of history bubble, and this is very late, and something neither you nor I have much expertise in. So, very interesting to hear about, because my knowledge was very minimal on this.
Yes, same here. And I had, in fact, told Bob before we talked that. Said you're going to have to guide the ship, because this is a new territory for me, pretty much. And like as you say, we kind of stay in our history bubble, but this is way more current than most things we talk about. So
well, and this was we mostly covered the beginning. Obviously, now it's rapidly expanding. It's just so interesting how far it's come. I don't really follow, the news to the letter about what's happening now at Disney, and then I looked up these boats, and it's wild. It's wild.
Yeah, these enormous new ships that they're building, and they're just rolling out one after the other, it feels like. And this experience, it's become a whole other subculture within fandom, that these, there are Disney cruise people who are their fandom consists of going on Disney cruises. So it has become its own thing.
It's like Fort Wilderness on the water.
Absolutely.
Well, excellent. Thanks, Bob, for joining us as always. I hope, we'd have Bob back in a heartbeat. We have something else to talk about with him.
Absolutely.
I always love to hear from Bob. He's such a great guy to give us so much of his time.
Absolutely. And we mentioned in the interview some of the talks he's done recently, and if you get a chance to see him present at something, take the opportunity, because it's always illuminating.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap up this show. And Michael, if people would like to know more about the things we discuss on the podcast, what would be one way they could find out more?
Well, you can always get all the latest info and the inside scoop by joining our Patreon and backing the show at patreon.com/ProgressCityUSA. You get some Progress City goodies. You get early access to episodes. You get access to my document library, my secret stash of Disney documents, and not very secret, but anyway, it sounds fun that way. And at the silver level, you get to join us for our monthly live stream, which have really been kicking off lately. I feel like they've been really buzzing with activity lately.
It's always a lot of fun. We had some great times with Early Disney Channel, which is, just felt like I was in my childhood all over again. So
that one took me way back, and everybody comes and joins in on the chat. It's a really good time, and hanging out on the Discord as well for the podcast Discord. So that's a lot of fun too. So sign up for it all. You can back us at patreon.com/ProgressCityUSA.
Yeah, and we thank those who already have joined us. I thank all of you for listening. If you'd like to be in touch, we can also be reached at podcast@ProgressCityUSA.com. And of course, we're on Twitter. Michael's at ProgressCityUSA. And I am at Jeff G. Crawford. Now, before we sign off today, Michael, would you like to give a little mysterious hint of what's coming next for us?
Oh, well, I'm really excited about this, actually. I feel as if we are, should we say, I keep thinking of different lines from If You Had Wings.
Yes, that's exactly right.
But this episode, you will be able to have cheap, because it's cheap is free. But yeah, we're kind of flying to Fiesta, I suppose you could say.
That's right. So take with that what you will, but join us, please, because you won't want to miss it. It'll be fun. But in the meantime, that's it for us here today. We thank you all for listening, and we look forward to you joining us next time. So long.